Okay, so this is part 2 on the fluids topic. I will be linking part 1 because this is a continuation. We are going to be talking about potassium, chloride, calcium, phosphate, and magnesium and their regulation. Starting with potassium. Potassium is known to be more dominant inside the cell as opposed to outside of the cell. So if I was to draw the cell, and then we have the intracellular fluid, ICF, and the extracellular fluid, the intracellular fluid will have about 98% of the potassium, and then the extracellular fluid will have only about 2%. Actually, potassium, which we call K+, is the most dominant cation inside the cell. So potassium is known to be the most dominant cation inside of the cell. And the fact that the potassium has more representation inside the cell is actually due to the action of the sodium potassium ATPase pump. So the sodium plus potassium ATP pump is what is responsible for maintaining this difference. Because what it does is that if this is the inside of the cell, and if this is the outside, exterior, what this pump will do is that it will use the energy from ATP to pump out 3 sodiums, and then it will pump in about 2 potassiums. All right. Generally, potassium is managed by the hormone aldosterone. So let's say that you have too much potassium. So if there is too much potassium in the blood, then the hormone aldosterone will get rid of this excess potassium, because it's going to basically go and act on the kidneys to force more of a K plus or potassium secretion. And so that potassium will get excreted into the urine to help drop the potassium level in the blood or in the plasma back down to normal levels. So that's part of the homeostasis. So potassium is constantly being lost in the urine, due to hormonal action. Um, and so the main thing to note about potassium is that it has a lot of use in the body. So potassium levels definitely do have a part to play when it comes to action potentials. So I'm not going to jump into it too much, but um, a lot of the time after the neuron or the nerve cell has gone through depolarization, getting the cell or the neuron back to normal levels is the function of potassium, because potassium will then rush back into the neuron to help restabilize the neuron so that the action potential can be completed. So it helps in the membrane repolarization. So K plus potassium helps in membrane repolarization, as well as helps in controlling heart rate. So, what do we call it when there is excess potassium in the blood? We would usually call that a hyperkalemia. So, too much potassium, elevated K plus in the blood, we call that hyperkalemia. And then too low potassium is hypokalemia. Um, Generally, potassium has a huge part to play when it comes to um, discussing the levels of H plus. So it's talking about the acidity of the blood. So let's briefly talk about that. Okay, So what I mean is that usually potassium and hydrogen ions, which control the pH, they usually travel in opposite directions. Let's talk about two different instances. Let's say that you're dealing with acidosis in the blood. There is too much H plus in the blood. Too much H plus. What that basically means is that if there's too much H plus, let's say this is a blood vessel and you have excess H plus, then the H plus will travel down its concentration gradient, and so it will travel outside of the blood, okay? And then it will then travel into your surrounding cells. So the H plus will enter into the surrounding cells. But this H plus tends to push out potassium. So K plus will then come out of the cell, and it will travel down its concentration gradient into the blood. So what that usually means is that acidosis in the blood eventually can lead to hyperkalemia, which is excess um, potassium in the blood. And then if we talk about alkalosis, that is alkalosis, alkaline. So we're talking about basic conditions. So there is only a very small amount of H plus in the blood. Okay. And so that means that H plus will need to travel outside of the surrounding tissues. So H plus will need to travel outside and then go into the blood to help restore H plus levels in the blood. But then that usually means that K plus will have to travel in the opposite direction. K plus will then have to travel into the cell. And so if you have, alkaline conditions in the blood, that can eventually lead to hypokalemia. So these acid-based disturbances can definitely affect the level of potassium in the blood, and that too can lead to, poor health. So, talking about the hyperkalemia, some of the health issues that a person can experience can be very life-threatening. So, we're talking about things like arrhythmias, heart palpitation. Um, you could even have abdominal pain, and there's just so much more that could happen. And so it's really important that if you experience symptoms of hyperkalemia, that you do go see a health professional. That's just as an aside. And then talking about the chloride ion, the chloride ion is what we call like the most abundant anion in the extracellular fluid. So again, let's draw our cell. So if I have a cell, and this is the intracellular fluid, and then outside of the cell there's extracellular fluid, you're going to see like loads of chloride just floating around outside of the cell, which kind of makes sense because it's going to be like kind of following sodium. So we know that sodium tends to be outside of the cell as well. So technically, chloride is also outside of the cell, mostly because it tends to follow sodium. But it is the most, chloride is the most abundant one in the ECF, most abundant anion. And so usually what would happen is that chloride also tends to get lost through urine. So if you are having hyperchloremia, so you can have excess chloride, that would be called hyperchloremia. Hyperchloremia, sorry. If you have hyperchloremia, then the excess chloride would get lost through the urine, and then you could also have hypochloremia. Um, Generally, for I think basic anatomy and physiology, you're not meant to know excessively too much about chloride, but just know that it is one of those critical anions that is primarily found in the ECF. Now, calcium. Calcium, we write that as Ca2 plus. It is a very critical electrolyte. It's primarily found in the bones and the teeth. So that's why you're always meant to drink calcium fortified milk, or, if you don't have a calcium heavy diet, you're meant to take supplements just so that you can have strong bones and strong teeth. It's not only because of these structures that calcium is important. Calcium is also very important when it comes to muscle contraction. It definitely also has a part to play in blood clotting, and it just does a lot in the body. So it's important that we have good calcium levels and that we prevent, too much calcium or too little calcium. Generally, calcium is moved outside of the cell through pumps. So calcium moves to the ECF using pumps. Calcium does tend to be stored in an organelle called the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the muscles. Unless it's triggered, unless muscle contraction is triggered, the calcium would usually get stored in the organelle called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And once the muscle is triggered to contract, then the calcium then travels out into the sarcoplasm, and eventually it binds, to the sarcomeres for contraction. When you have excess calcium is called hyperkalemia or hypercalcemia, sorry. Hypercalcemia. So, calcium definitely does have a part to play when it comes to muscle contraction. So, if you have too much calcium, that means that you are going to experience. So, it causes underexcitability. And the reason why it causes underexcitability in the muscle and in the neurons, in electrically stimulatable cells in general, is because calcium tends to stabilize the voltage gated sodium channels. So calcium stabilizes voltage gated sodium channels. And typically, basically, that means that it keeps them closed. That isn't good because the sodium channels need to open in the neurons in order for the action potential and for muscle contraction, for all those things to happen. The calcium needs to be low enough to allow the voltage gated channels to open up and perform action potentials that can eventually lead to muscle contractions. So, usually, high sodium in the blood means hypercalcemia. So that excess calcium then goes into the tissues, into the electrically excitable cells like the neurons and the muscles, and that leads to underexcitement. And also, a lot of the times, the high calcium can also be a result of bone breakdown. So basically, the bone breaks down or resorbs. And that bone breakdown releases all the calcium that was stored in the bone, and then that calcium then goes into the bloodstream. So a lot of the time people who are experiencing hypercalcemia also have weaker bones because all the calcium that was stored in the bone structure then got released into the blood, hence resulting in the hypercalcemia. As expected, when you have hypocalcemia is the direct opposite. So your cells become extremely excitable, hypocalcemia. So the cells become over excited, because there isn't that calcium there to stabilize the voltage gated sodium channel. So it becomes, more stimulatable. So the sodium channels can open up, and then that results in, more of action in terms of muscle contraction and the like. So you can either have hypercalcemia, excess calcium, or you can have hypocalcemia, which is, small amounts of calcium. It is worth noting as well that calcium plays a very critical part in the clotting pathway. So, affecting the calcium levels can also affect the efficacy of blood clotting. So, calcium usually helps with blood clotting. Next thing is phosphate. So phosphate has a lot of important functions. Most critical among these are the fact that it's a very important component of DNA, RNA, and phospholipids. These are all very critical structures because the DNA and the RNA, well, those play a very important part in our genetic material. We need it for, preservation of life. And then the phospholipids, well, those ones are, the majority component of our cell membranes, right? So we definitely do need the phospholipids as well. And then the phosphates also combines with calcium in the bones and the teeth to form calcium phosphates. So about 85% of phosphates that's in the body, phosphates is PO43 minus, is actually stored along with calcium in the bones and the teeth. So these hard structures, bones and teeth, are primarily calcium phosphates. Okay, and then phosphate has a very important role to play as it is a known buffer. And so generally, buffers are things that help to stabilize the pH level in the blood and the fluids. So we definitely need phosphate because it's an intracellular, so inside the cell, it acts as a buffer to keep the pH stable. And believe it or not, it's also a buffer in the urine as well. So when you urinate, um, there also has to be some type of pH balance, as well. So it's also a buffer in urination as well. We have the two levels of phosphatemia. So you can have excess phosphates in the blood, and that is called hyperphosphatemia. You can also have low phosphates in the blood. That is hypophosphatemia. And then finally, we can talk about magnesium. Magnesium is very prevalent, so that's Mg2 plus. It's very prevalent in the bone. But apart from that, if we were to do our cell lookup, so you have the ICF and the ECF, then you definitely find that magnesium is more prevalent in the ICF as well. Magnesium has a very important role to play when it comes to enzymes. So it definitely helps to support enzymatic action. And magnesium, in terms of that, we can say that magnesium is a cofactor. And it's actually a cofactor in a lot of enzymes. And by cofactor, it just basically means that if we have an enzyme, a lot of the times, most of these enzymes would need to bind to magnesium in some way or shape in order for them to have a positive enzymatic action. So that's why magnesium is very important to the activity of our body and our metabolic reactions. And then the magnesium also does play a part in assisting the function of the sodium potassium pump, which we see all over our cells and body. And a lot of the time, it also has a part to play in regulation of muscles. And by that, I mean muscle relaxation. And then if you have excess magnesium, so high levels of magnesium, we call that hypermagnesemia. High levels of magnesium in the blood, that is hypermagnesemia. And then low levels, that's called hypomagnesemia. Um, So, in terms of how magnesium is lost from the body, so let's say that you take excess dietary magnesium in the form of food. So, you take a lot of food that has magnesium in it and you need to get rid of the magnesium. Then, magnesium is typically lost through, filtration and the action of the kidneys. So, magnesium can either get lost through the action of the kidneys, resulting in loss of magnesium through urine, or it could also be lost from the body through sweat. So this is just an overview of all the different cations and anions that we would typically be focusing on in the body. Um, each of them has more to it, but this is just like a summary of the different anions and cations that you typically need to know at your level.